we have been looking at the national movement among Ukrainians, or more properly Ruthenians as they were known in the Austrian Empire. The series of lectures that we're giving now specifically on the Austrian Empire, or the status of Ukrainians, Ruthenians in it during our long 19th century. We had discussed, or begun to discuss, the role of the imperial Habsburg authorities in instituting a whole series of reforms under the leadership of our two rulers, Maria Theresa and Joseph II, how those reforms played a very important role for education and church, and this is throughout the empire, but in particular, those reforms had an impact on Galicia's Ruthenians during that period. And I made mention of one of those educational institutions in Vienna called the Barbareum, set up in the year 1775, 1784, set up to educate seminarians, Greek Catholic seminarians, who came to the imperial capital. And even though that Barbareum as a seminary lasted only for 9 years, if you will, it continued to function for another 90 years, nearly a century, till the end of the 19th century, as a student residence, cultural center for seminarians, again, Ruthenian seminarians, who came to the imperial capital and to study in other seminaries and universities. And it was during that period in which they actually had the opportunity to be in the imperial empire that they interacted with fellow Slavic peoples and the highest level of the intelligentsia in the Austrian Empire, from whom they learned the experience of Czechs and Slovaks and Serbians, Slovenians in particular, in other parts of the empire, with regard to a love of their own people, national movements, etc. This reform atmosphere, if you will, programmatic activity on the part of Maria Theresa and Joseph II certainly lasted during their reigns, but started to change in the Austrian Empire at the outset of the chronological 19th century. This had to do in part because of the result of the Napoleonic Wars that were raging throughout Europe. Austria was attacked by France. The efforts of the Austrian rulers, together with the rulers of Prussia and Russia, to put down revolutionary activity that was being spread by Napoleonic forces throughout the continent. And so by the outset of the 19th century, we have a conservative trend in politics throughout Europe as a whole. Everyone is afraid of those dangerous French and those always prone to uprisings had to be somehow controlled, and certainly control any revolutionary ideas within these empires. This whole period was symbolized in the Austrian Empire, that came to represent much of conservative attitudes throughout Europe in those first decades of the chronological 19th century, by a man named Klemens von Metternich, who was the chancellor of the Austrian Empire. And what we have is the creation of a closely controlled, more or less, police state, suspicion about any kind of change. As a result of this, the Ruthenian or Ukrainian national movement that we have been looking at, and that, in a sense, began with the second stage, organizational, now reverted to the first stage, the heritage gathering stage. And so for these decades of the 1820s, certainly 1830s, 1840s, it is marked by the activity of intellectuals during that intellectually inspired national movements, of which the Ruthenian Ukrainian movement was. Intellectuals comprised mostly of Greek Catholic seminarians, which was the intelligentsia, if you will, budding intelligentsia and priesthood in Galicia. And the first centers were in these two towns that were in Galicia, obviously, Przemysl or Peremysl, which you know from your maps, which is on the border of present-day Poland, Ukraine, just on the Polish side. And of course, the administrative center of Galicia, the Habsburg administrative center of Lviv. And what was happening, what is normally happening during this heritage gathering stage of intelligentsia-inspired national movements? We have publications of histories particular of Galicia. The intelligentsia, both Ruthenian as well as Polish, who were sympathetic to the Ruthenians, go out into the countryside and they collect folk songs. They write down the speech of the local inhabitants, publish grammars, publish texts. And in fact, language, which the great German philosopher of the time Herder pronounced as being a key element in identifying a nationality. The language question, which was not terribly important, interestingly, among Little Russians or Ukrainians in the Russian Empire, here in Galicia it becomes supremely important. In fact, it's almost the only thing that's really being discussed. Because if you want to promote a national movement of a specific people, well, according to Herder, they should have their own language. But what was the language, or what should be the, in particular, literary language of the Ruthenians living in Galicia? Naturally, they had used the liturgical language, which is called Church Slavonic, within the Greek Catholic Church. But this was hardly the language of the populace. And so several of these intellectuals argued for use of the spoken vernacular, that our language should reflect how people speak. Some of them said, no, we need a more sophisticated language or an already existing one, preferable to use Russian as our literary language. So all of these debates go on in particular in the 1830s and 1840s, and symbolized by three, at the time, seminarians, Greek Catholic seminarians, known as the Ruthenian Triad, Shashkevych, Vahylevych, and Holovatskyi. And in 1837, to reflect their ideas, particularly on language, they publish a collection called Rusalka Dnistrovaia. Includes folk songs, not only of Galician Ruthenians, but also of other fellow Slavs, but all written in what form of language? The vernacular, to reflect how people actually spoke, would make it easier for them to understand. And then on top of it, which is a little bit too complex to get into here, instead of using the old Slavonic alphabet as Church Slavonic in liturgical books. They used a more modern form of the Cyrillic alphabet, for all intents and purposes that which we know today when we look at the Cyrillic alphabet. So these are the kinds of activities that preoccupied Galician Ruthenian movement during the first half of the chronological 19th century. And so to sum up this period that we began to speak about last time, while this Galician Ruthenian national movement did get off to a promising start after Galicia became part of the Austrian Empire in that key year of 1772, and it got off to that promising start clearly with the help of the Austrian imperial government. And we saw how that played itself out in terms of the educational system, not only high-level education, but universal education in the vernacular at the elementary level. The church structure was enhanced. The status of Greek Catholics were made as much as possible equal to the other Catholic rites, in particular the Roman rite. But then we also just saw how by the second decade of the 1800s, these achievements had largely been undercut by a political and social environment that was conservative in nature, and an environment in which the authorities were suspicious of change and suspicious of change of any kind. And again, symbolized by that Chancellor Klemens von Metternich. And as for the Ruthenians themselves, their small educated stratum, mostly priests, clerics, some secular lawyers, teachers, they now became susceptible to the dominant cultures among whom they lived, susceptible to assimilation with the Poles, or in the case of Transcarpathia, the Hungarians, or even, if possible, susceptible to assimilation into imperial Austro-German culture. And so it was left to this heritage-gathering intelligentsia, symbolized by the Ruthenian triad, to carry out its work. And as I said, it did carry it out in the areas of writing histories, collecting ethnographic materials, and debating the language question. Note I say debating. Why? Because nothing decisive was achieved. It was necessary to await some more profound change in the political and social environment of the Austrian Empire. Well, that change did come, and it came with the revolution of 1848. And it is to that subject that we must now turn. 1848. (1848) is one of those years. In history courses, sometimes in the old days, you got too many dates. Now you hardly have any dates. Well, remember this date. It has become ingrained as an important landmark in modern European history as a whole. And the reason for that is that simultaneously, throughout much of the European continent, a series of revolutions broke out, which were to have a profound impact on the future of the societies that were affected by those events. And 1848 was particularly significant for Central Europe, both for the Germanic lands and for the Slavic and Hungarian lands within the Prussian and Austrian empires, where the fervor, revolutionary fervor of 1848 took root or expressed itself in virtually every land of the European continent. There was one exception in which there was no, not even slight, uprising in 1848, and that was the Russian Empire. But we're not in the Russian Empire, we're in the Austrian Empire. Now, the causes of the 1848 revolution, whether they were political or socioeconomic or national, it varied from place to place throughout the continent. For instance, in some places like the Austrian Empire, all three causes were present. Again, those three causes: political, socioeconomic, and the nationality question. But it was the nationality question which was to be the source of the greatest number of immediate and subsequent changes. And it's for this reason that 1848 revolution has come to be known, at least in Central Europe, as the Spring of Nations, or the springtime of nationalities. Now, we will look at, but before looking specifically at developments among the Ruthenians, Ukrainians, in the Habsburg Empire, first we have to say something about developments as a whole in Austria's Habsburg-ruled lands. And the period in question now that we want to look at, it's actually quite brief, from March 1848 to August 1849. Well, what happened during those 18 turbulent months? Those causes that I mentioned of the 1848 revolution, beginning in our case in the imperial capital Vienna in March of that year, hence our beginning date. How did that happen? Well, first of all, there was news and inspiration from the French in Paris, who had revolted the month before and started this in Europe in February 1848. Another cause, or another phenomenon in the Austrian Empire leading to revolt, was unrest in Austria's northern Italian provinces. Remember, I mentioned that all of these areas, can't see on this map, but all of northern Italy, even as far south as Tuscany, were part of the Austrian Empire, and they were very displeased with Austrian rule, Habsburg rule. Then there was radical agitation in the Hungarian Diet, the largest component of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the Hungarian kingdom. Of course, much of the Habsburg Empire were inhabited by German speakers, which we can call more properly Austro-Germans. However, the larger Germanic world was planning to have an all-Germanic assembly in Frankfurt, and those German activists expected participation from Austro-Germans, minimally from the Habsburg Empire. And then there was a prolonged economic crisis, in particular in Austria's urban areas, cities. All of these factors, which I've just mentioned, provided the background for the week of March 6th to 12th, March 6th to 12th, when in the imperial capital of Vienna, several members of the urban educated professional strata of society, lawyers, doctors, other professionals, and in particular students, began circulating petitions calling for an immediate introduction of civil liberties, and that is freedom of the press, trial by jury, civil rights, academic freedom, emancipation of the peasants, and also a constitutional representative government, a parliament of some kind. All of these things were not possible during the conservative era during the first half of the chronological 19th century. And so what happened? Real quickly. First, already in March, the symbol of conservative reactionary rule, Klemens von Metternich, is forced to resign by the imperial authorities. Following month in April, the imperial government convokes a constitutional assembly. It was known as the Reichstag. So now we have a constitutional assembly. The following month in May, the imperial government announces the abolition of serfdom. The abolition of serfdom. And so beginning after this week of the 16th and 12th to the 12th of March, it's the Austrian imperial government that initiates a series of reforms from above in hope of counteracting revolution from below. One would expect that this might work. Well, in fact, the Habsburgs did do something, obviously, but in the context of the situation at the time, they effectively did too little, too late. Not surprisingly, for the Habsburgs, their greatest problem was with the largest component of the Austrian Empire, the Hungarian kingdom. The Hungarian kingdom. Just 1 week after the protests broke out on the streets of Vienna, 1 week later, on March 15, Hungarian activists, led by a man named Lajos Kossuth, demanded the creation of an elected national parliament, specifically for Hungary, to govern its own affairs. And also, they demanded the creation of a national army, a Hungarian national army, to provide its own defense. The imperial authorities in Vienna, the Habsburg authorities, did agree to a Hungarian parliament, but they weren't going to move on the question of a national army, and they refused to allow a separate Hungarian army. Well, the newly elected Hungarian parliament formed an army anyway. Also adopted a separate budget and a separate currency. This didn't look good from the imperial perspective, and in response, Vienna dispatches an armed force into Hungary, while its parliament, under the leadership of Kossuth, now authorized the newly created Hungarian army to resist the Austrians, to resist the imperial authorities. With civil war now in Hungary imminent, workers and troops in Vienna itself were prompted to rebel in October of that year. And then at the very end of that year, in December, the emperor abdicates and instead in favor of his 18-year-old nephew, remember, someone younger than any of you sitting around this table, I think, and in favor now of his nephew, 18-year-old Archduke named Franz, and the transfer of power takes place in December 2nd, in deference to the liberal spirit of the times. The new 18-year-old sovereign added to his name Joseph, to recall his great-grandfather Joseph II, the reformer of the late 18th century, the enlightened liberator. And so it was now this new emperor, Franz Joseph, by the way, comes to power in 1848. He was to rule 68 years, remarkably until 1916, during World War I. In fact, just 2 years before the complete demise of the Habsburg Empire. Now, with the accession of a new monarch, in a sense, this gave legal justification to those ornery Hungarians, and Kossuth, leading, of course, figure in the Hungarian Revolution, now had a legal excuse to continue on their political course. Why a legal excuse? Well, they refused to recognize this new emperor, Franz Joseph, since he was not crowned in Hungary as King of Hungary. And of course, every new Habsburg emperor had to be first crowned emperor in Vienna, in Austria, emperor of Austria, and a king of Hungary. Well, obviously, he couldn't be crowned. He couldn't go to Hungary to become crowned because there was a war now going on. This made it a nice excuse for Kossuth and the Hungarians. That led in April 1849 for Kossuth to proclaim Hungary an independent republic. Fierce fighting now with the Austrian Imperial Army continues until the summer of 1849. In a desperate attempt to save the Habsburg Empire, Hungary, the kingdom is obviously a dominant portion of it. Now, what does the young Franz Joseph do? He calls upon Tsar Nicholas I of Russia to help him. There's this famous scene which is pretty remarkable. He travels north to Warsaw. Warsaw, of course, is the present-day capital of Poland. Warsaw was part of the Russian Empire. There he meets with Nicholas II. He gets down on his knees, kisses his hand, and asks him for help. This is one emperor to another. Nicholas is ready, always concerned about revolutionary activity of any kind, and sends a massive Russian army that crosses the Carpathians, first enters Galicia, crosses the Carpathians into Hungary. And on August 13, 1849, the forces of the Hungarian Revolutionary Army are forced to capitulate. And that's the end of the Hungarian Revolution, and hence the end of this very brief period that we're talking about, 1848, March 1848 to August 1849. With this defeat of the Hungarians at the hands of a combined Russian and Austrian armies, the only major threat now that was the Hungarian problem, this threat is now put to rest. Now, this revolution of 1848 also had a lasting impact upon the political, socioeconomic, and most especially cultural and national life of the Ruthenians, or the Ukrainians of the Austrian Empire. And now we turn to that situation. Basically, the Austrian imperial government gave its support to the Ruthenians and to their efforts to obtain recognition as a nationality and their desire for political and cultural rights. Crucial to all of this, that is to Austrian imperial policy, was the appointment in 1847 of an energetic and innovative new governor of Galicia named Count Franz Stadion. Franz Stadion. From the perspective of the imperial authorities in Vienna, the Polish gentry and the intelligentsia in Galicia, and the Polish gentry had revolted against Austria just 2 years before in 1846. It was put down, but nonetheless, clearly from the imperial authorities, the Polish aristocracy, supported by local intelligentsia, was untrustworthy. And therefore, this Stadion, Governor Stadion, was prepared to use any element, whether it was the Polish peasants themselves, who, even though they were Polish, were not really supportive of their own landlords. So we make use of the Polish peasants or the Ruthenian peasants. And as we're going to see, let's make use of the Ruthenian intelligentsia to counteract the Polish gentry and aristocratic forces within Galicia. This Stadion's policy was simply directed at allying with whatever force would strengthen the interests of the Austrian state. And it's in this sense that Austrian and Ruthenian interests coincided in 1848. And so when news of those revolutionary events in Vienna in early March, and when the Poles themselves in Galicia established a Polish National Council, they're ready too. Everyone's in a revolutionary mood. And the Polish National Council demands extensive autonomy for what they considered a purely Polish land, Galicia, and all of Galicia. What did Stadion do? He called on the Ruthenians to organize themselves, and the result was a petition from the Ruthenians addressed to the emperor in April, calling for recognition of their nationality and for the division of Galicia into two separate provinces. There would be, according to them, a West Galicia, which would be primarily Polish, and an East Galicia, primarily Ruthenian. Well, what was the result now of Austria's interest in these Ruthenians of Galicia? Several major achievements occurred within these 18 months from March 1848 to August 1849. We looked at the empire as a whole. Now, what was going on in Galicia, and in particular among the Ruthenian population during this time? Well, during those 18 months, 7 achievements were made. We call them achievements because effectively, in terms of the national movement, that's what they were. The first was the creation of, actually, the first Ukrainian Ruthenian political organization in the modern era. It was called the Supreme Ruthenian Council. Russian Rada, the Supreme Ruthenian Council. It was established in May of 1848, and it demanded three things, or proclaimed three things. First of all, it made it clear that Ruthenians were a distinct nationality, and first and foremost distinct with the Poles, because the Poles were basically saying, well, all of these Ruthenians, they're just Eastern Rite Catholics, but they're part of Galicia, they're Poles as well. No, Supreme Ruthenian Council says, we are Ruthenians, you are Poles. Second thing is that they proclaimed that their nationality was not just this roughly 2.5 million East Slavs, Ruthenians living in Galicia, but they were part of a larger 15 million strong Ruthenian Ukrainian nationality, just like those living in the southern part of the Russian Empire. And the third thing that this council proclaimed and in a case demanded was this division of Galicia into two separate provinces of the future Austrian Empire, a Western Polish Galicia and an Eastern Ruthenian Galicia. The second very important thing that took place were elections to this imperial parliament, the Reichstag, which took place in June of 1848. And the population of Galicia, in particular landowners, and peasants were landowners, participated in the elections, and Galicia, and 35 deputies from Galicia into this new parliament were Ruthenians. And among them, 23 were peasants. And so, just a couple of weeks before, these people are proprietary peasants owned by landlords. Now, they're sitting in the imperial parliament in Vienna. And by the way, they were participating in the debates. The third thing that happened was a sense of unity among Slavic peoples in general. There was a whole movement that took place during the began during the first part of the 19th century called Pan-Slavism, the idea that most Slavic peoples, with the exception of Russians and Montenegrins, most others did not have their own Slavic states, so the Slavs should cooperate together, regardless of what empire they lived in. And now, during this revolutionary era, Slavic leaders, particularly among the Czechs, call for a Slavic Congress that takes place in Prague, within the Austrian Empire. Delegates of Slavic peoples from within the empire and from without the empire, beyond the empire. A couple from Russia even showed up. They all meet in Prague. But the important thing here is that not only do the Ruthenian delegations show up, but the rest of the Slavic world recognizes them as a distinct nationality. So now they get an imprimatur from their fellow Slavs. The next thing that happens is that the very first newspaper, specifically in the Ruthenian language, called Zoria Halicka, the Galician Dawn, is established. Publication activity flourishes. Just in the year 1848, 156 titles, mostly political brochures and other small pamphlets, but also books, 158 are published in the Ruthenian language. Also, the first cultural societies. There's a Congress of Ruthenian Scholars, established in October 1848. A campaign to create a national home, national center, is begun in early 1849. A Galician Rus cultural foundation, or Matica, is established. So we'll have three, at least, major cultural organizations. And then, in December, the Austrian authorities approved the creation of an entire department, professorial chair, of Ruthenian language and literature at the University of Lviv. Finally, the revolution is going on. We have the Hungarians still in full force. We're not yet in August 1849. And the local authorities approved the establishment of Ruthenian military units formed to fight on the side of Austria against Hungary. Now, I might add that those two other areas, Ruthenian inhabited areas, Little Bukovina over to the right, and then Transcarpathia in the Hungarian kingdom, also underwent a national awakening and political activity, in particular among the Ruthenians of Hungary during this crucial months of 1848-1849. Now, as you might imagine, Polish leaders in Galicia were very much displeased with all of these developments, and we have the beginning of long polemical debates between Poles and between Ruthenians, but Ruthenians, for all intents and purposes, are protected by the Austrian authorities with the result of those achievements that I have just mentioned. And so the significance of this revolutionary year, 1848, spilling over into 1849, the significance of it for Ruthenians living within the Austrian Empire cannot be overstated. At the very same time, in the Russian-ruled Dnieper, Ukraine, there, where, as we have seen, the first efforts at organizing a Ukrainian organization, that Brotherhood of St. Cyril and Methodius, 1845, 1846, same time, were liquidated, with the result that the leading members of the Ukrainian intelligentsia in the Russian Empire, also their trio, Shevchenko, Kostomarov, and Kulish, were arrested and or banned, exiled from their homeland. At the very same time that that's going on over there, in the Austrian Empire, the Ruthenians in Galicia, and to a lesser degree in Hungarian-ruled Transcarpathia, were making remarkable advances in their national life. As we've just seen, in Galicia, the Ruthenians got their own political and cultural organizations, their own newspapers and publications, their own deputies to the imperial parliament. Their largest social stratum, the peasantry, was emancipated from serfdom, and its members had already begun to participate in political life. Ruthenians also interacted with other Slavic peoples in the Austrian Empire, and the Galicians even had their own military formations. And all of these developments took place with the blessings, the encouragement, and at times the very initiative of the Habsburg imperial government and its representatives, in particular Count Franz Stadion. The difference between what was going on among Ukrainians, Ruthenians in the Austrian Empire and the Russian Empire could not have been greater. We will see how now these achievements of 1848 will play themselves out in the national movement during the second half of our long 19th century, 1848 or 49 to 1914, when we return. Thank you.